everyone! This time I'm going to be reacting to the most bizarre US president deaths in history! This is by the affiliate, so please go subscribe to him. Anyways, as always, we have our co-hosts USA, UK, North Korea, and Netherlands boys. Hi everyone! Hey old chaps! Hi! Remember, if you leave North Korea leaves you in a sign. Anyways, hi! Hi! Glory to the Netherlands once again. As always, wonderful pictures and things. Again, you're welcome, as always. Anyways, every single purchase of at least one of these contributions will definitely support the channel for sure. Let's begin with
Zachary Taylor.
Ta-da!
In 1850, President Zachary Taylor died, and his death would go down in American history as being one of the strangest. You see, Taylor was a career soldier nicknamed Old Rough and Ready, and had survived decades of brutal military campaigns, harsh climates, and dangerous battles. Yet, while attending an Independence Day celebration on a hot July day in Washington, D.C., and eating a big bowl of raw cherries, iced milk, and large amounts of cucumber, he lost his life 5 days later. Apparently later that evening, he had developed severe stomach pains, diarrhea, and vomiting, and his condition just worsened from there. 5 days later, the president was dead at just 65 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as acute gastroenteritis, which basically means a severe stomach illness. However, his death is still very suspicious because it was so sudden and unusual. It was really hard to believe that a man as strong as Taylor could be killed by cherries and milk. The theory and suspicions of foul play lingered for over a century. But on June 17, 1991, his body was exhumed and tested for traces of poison or foul play. No signs of arsenic poisoning were found in his remains. So it's likely Taylor really did die from contaminated food or water, which was common in 19th century Washington. William Henry Harrison.
Silly Taylor. Ad time, chaps. Skip.
President William Henry Harrison's death is definitely one of the strangest, and it's simply because of how oddly preventable it was. You see, he was elected in 1840 at the age of 68, so he was the oldest president, at least at that time. So it was kind of a big deal, so to show that he was tough and capable, the man gave the longest inaugural address in American history. The speech lasted for almost 2 hours, and what's worse is that he was standing throughout in the extremely cold and wet Washington weather. He wasn't even wearing a hat, coat, or gloves. Well, not long after, he got very sick with pneumonia. Doctors were called in, but their medical practices at the time were basically prescribing hard for headaches and did nothing to help the man. There was even a remedy that involved the use of live snakes, but all that just made his condition worse. Surprising. It was so sad that the president, who wanted to seem strong, was literally weakened by his own bravado and bad weather. He literally died just 31 days after taking office, and will now be remembered as the shortest presidency in American history. But here's the twist. Modern historians and medical researchers believe that the cause of his death wasn't actually pneumonia, but that he may have died from typhoid fever caused by contaminated drinking water at the White House. At that time, it was very common because sewage often leaked into the water supply. However, whatever the truth is, the fact remains that his presidency was over almost before it began. Those really were the days. James A. Garfield.
Harrison.
On July 2nd, 1881, President James Garfield was shot in the back as he walked past the Potomac train station by Charles Guiteau, a disgruntled, unhappy man who believed he was owed a government job. Fortunately, the bullet did not
This will
instantly
leave
kill
you
Garfield.
absolutely
The wound
shocked
itself might not
and
have even
shattered
been
for-
fatal because the bullet didn't hit any major
the rest of your
organs.
life.
However, disaster still struck
I'm
because the
joking,
doctors
but-
treating him seriously lacked proper medical procedure. Apparently, doctors in the 1880s didn't believe in germ theory, so none of them washed their hands or even tried to use sterilized tools. They just
Absolutely
repeatedly poked and prodded the
disgusting,
man with
Mr.
hands
Doctor.
and tools full of dirt and germs. They even employed the
Why
use
would
of a
you
metal
treat
detector
your
whose
own
aim was to
president
try and
like
find
that?
the bullet,
You-
but the only thing their help did was
seriously
cause
killed
massive
him.
infections. The
Seriously,
man was
a
gradually
knife and
getting
king.
sicker and suffered horribly for nearly
Well-
3 months. He developed several pus-filled abscesses,
Also,
lost over
Mr.
100
Gateau
pounds,
shot him,
and ate all
which
sorts of
might
really
have also
disgusting
killed
meals
him.
just to be kept alive. What makes this whole ordeal worse is that new medical practices like antiseptics were already popular in Europe, so he was basically just getting tortured by his own medical team. Finally, on September 19th, 1881, the man finally died.
Well,
the irony,
certain
he wasn't
torture
killed by
was
the assassin,
actually kind
but
of
by his
acceptable.
doctors. Abraham Lincoln. People often remember
Yahoo!
Abraham Lincoln as the
Abraham
first
Lincoln,
president to ever
bye-bye.
successfully get assassinated. And this was because assassinating
That's
a
actually now
president
one
was
of
a
my
very strange
catchphrases.
and unheard of thing at the time. But on April 14,
My other ones are,
1865,
"Did you
just
know?"
days after the Civil War
And
ended,
well,
this
son.
was precisely what happened. You see, Lincoln had decided to attend a play
We
at
catch
Ford's
racists
Theater
now.
in Washington, D.C., which was a pretty bad decision because he had been receiving threats for years. What's worse, he went to the
Why does
public
he look
theater
like
with
a
very
singer
minimal
or
protection
something
for a
like that?
president. In fact, the man who assassinated him was a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth. He was literally a celebrity at the time and had used his insider knowledge of
looks
the area
so
to sneak into
different
Lincoln's
from
box and
his
shoot him in the
wife,
back of
Mary
the head.
Todd.
The strangest part was how easy it was for a well-known actor to easily sneak in and assassinate the president during a play in front of millions of people. The bullet didn't even kill him immediately,
Well,
and he was carried across the
only
street
a
to be
few
a boarding
hundred people
house where
attended
doctors
the play,
tried to save
but
him. He lingered for hours, slipping
millions
in and
of
out of
people in
consciousness
America
before
was
finally
devastated.
kicking the bucket the next morning on April 15th. The whole ordeal from getting murdered in public to the strange coincidences makes his death very unforgettable in American history. Franklin Pierce. After leaving the White House in 1857, Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, life spiraled downhill into a very disgraceful mess. Unlike many of his predecessors who had died from war wounds or assassinations, Pierce's end was tied directly to his long battle
Well,
with
not
alcohol.
for persons
Firstly,
people
the
who
man
died
had
from
already experienced a
assassinations.
lot of deep personal tragedies and begged.
And only two
The most
died in
notable
others
was the untimely death of his
True.
3 children. In fact, his youngest son was brutally killed in a gruesome train
Well,
accident
Pierce
just
did
weeks
die
before
after the
Pierce's
assassination of
inauguration.
Lincoln.
Then, throughout the entire presidency, he was faced with the threat of civil war, political manipulations, and continuous fights and protests. Safe to say, Pierce was broken in spirit and turned heavily to alcohol for solace. He drank so much that he became one of the first presidents openly described as struggling with alcoholism. So by the time he clocked 60, his health was a huge mess. He started suffering from cirrhosis of the liver, a deadly condition caused by years of heavy drinking. Finally, in October
Oh,
1869,
this is actually...
The way you see an idea in your mind and shape it into something that could only come from you.
his body shut down. He suddenly just collapsed and died in Concord, New Hampshire at just 64 years old. His death was so strange because he was the first president that didn't die as an image of leadership and strength, but as a largely forgotten and pitied president. Pierce is literally remembered more for drinking himself to death than for his presidency. Thomas Jefferson
Oh.
and John Adams. When we talk about strange presidential deaths, none top the cosmic timing of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. These two men weren't just presidents, but were a literal American experiment. Firstly, Adams held the position of the second U.S. president, while Jefferson held the position of the third. However, they weren't exactly the best of friends. You could even go as far as calling them rivals, but as the years went by, the two agreed on some sort of friendship and together represented the intellectual backbone of the Revolution. Their shared interest led to a strong friendship that lasted for years and would even transcend to their deaths. Both men died on July 4th, 1826,
Wow,
exactly 50
what a
years to the day after the
coincidence.
Declaration of
Crazy.
Independence was adopted. Yes, they died on the golden jubilee of the very document they had poured their energy into creating and defending. The coincidence doesn't end here, because while 90-year-old Adams was in Massachusetts, sick and frail, 83-year-old Jefferson was equally bedridden and dying in Virginia. His health had been getting worse since 1818, when he visited a spa to find relief for his rheumatism. He also suffered from swollen legs, painful joints, fatigue, a fractured left wrist, a boil on his jaw, increasing deafness, and unspecified illnesses, and they just kept getting worse. The weirdest part is that these two men didn't even know of each other's condition. Jefferson, always the idealist, seemed determined to make it and reportedly kept asking if it was the 4th of July yet. Finally passed away in the early hours of July 4th. A couple hours later, Adams gave up the ghost too, but his final words would forever be etched in history. According to witnesses, he said Thomas Jefferson still survives. But in reality, Jefferson had already died earlier that day. It was disturbingly poetic.
I don't think
and
he said
the timing
Thomas
of
Jefferson
both
still
of them dying on the exact 50th
He didn't say for
Independence
still,
Day
according
made it
to
extremely
us.
strange.
He just said
James
Thomas
Monroe,
Jefferson survives, clearly.
Revolutionary War hero, founding father, president during the era of good feelings, James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States, was known by a lot of names and lived quite a dramatic life. However, the strangeness of his death was what made his presidential tenure stand out in history. Monroe also strangely died on July 4th, 1831, which was already causing a lot of stir because 2 other U.S. presidents, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, had died exactly 5 years earlier on that day. These 3 presidents were all deeply tied to the founding of the country, so dying on the exact same day seemed strangely patriotic. Their deaths almost felt supernatural, as if the men who shaped the nation had timed their exits with symbolic precision. In fact, newspapers at the time called it the Hand of Providence. Plus, after his presidency, Monroe moved in with his daughter in New York because he was deeply in debt. He had spent much of his personal fortune during his career in public service, and Congress refused to fully reimburse him, which was something that was embarrassingly common for ex-presidents back then. However, the actual cause of his death was tuberculosis, because after years of struggling, he was extremely weak and suffering. On the morning of July 4th, while church bells and cannons fired in celebration of America's 55th Independence Day, Monroe was taking his final breaths. Today, historians literally point to this and call it the July 4th presidential curse, and it has remained one of the strangest quirks in American history. Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the 7th U.S. president, and you could well say that this man was practically living on borrowed time for a very long time. Jackson was born in 1767 and had been through a life that reads more like an action movie than a presidential biography. He had survived smallpox as a kid, duels as a young man, and even major military battles where he should have died. He had several bullet holes and scars that looked like he lived a life that was constantly flirting with death. So by the time he became president in 1829, his body was already weak from all the drama it had been put through, but this didn't stop him from living a full, almost healthy life. In fact, on January 30th, 1835, Jackson almost got assassinated by Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter. The man aimed a pistol at Jackson, but it misfired. So he tried again with a second pistol, which also misfired, and a furious Jackson charged at him with his cane until others could pull Lawrence away. Lawrence was declared insane and institutionalized. Jackson would go on to live well into his 70s, but by this time, he was pretty sick with a strange mix of chronic health issues. Jackson was suffering from dropsy, which was a weird condition that causes liquids to swell in his body. He also suffered from
Whoa. I don't know
tuberculosis,
what happened.
heart failure, and constant chest pain because there was a bullet lodged in his chest from a duel that never got removed. The bullet caused him lifelong pain and severe coughing fits where he'd even spit up blood. Yet, Jackson refused to die. He kept struggling through the pain and remained president. Throughout his presidency, the man was constantly looking pale, weak, and skinny, but he still managed to run the country, fight political enemies, and live longer than many of his healthier peers. He was...
Oh, no, that's again. Come on.
so stubbornly tough that people joked he wasn't human, but iron wrapped in flesh. But eventually, the rust on the iron started becoming too hard to ignore. So by the time he reached his last days at the Hermitage, he was basically a medical miracle that had finally run out of steam. What makes his condition so bizarre is that there wasn't really advanced medical care or medications that could manage or help his symptoms. So the man basically survived off sheer will and stubbornness. Sadly, on June 8th, 1845,
Jackson was
after
just
receiving
so
last
lucky
rites,
to
he
live
calmly
that
told his
long.
family he was ready to go and passed away in his bed. Ulysses S. Grant. When you hear strange presidential deaths, the first thing you'll think of are assassinations, death in battle, or just a freak accident. However, for President Ulysses S. Grant, who was a Civil War hero and the 18th President of the United States, his downfall came from something incredibly ordinary but extremely deadly: cancer. Yeah, the man had cancer of the throat that was caused by his lifelong addiction to
Wow,
cigars.
I can't believe
What
you're
makes this
the
even worse
first
was that Grant never
president who
used to
has
smoke
cancer.
much before. He was a very casual smoker
Very
up
sad,
until
of
his
course,
big
but
victory at
I
Fort
thought
Donelson
earlier
in
persons would
1862.
catch the
News
same
outlets reported that he
disease.
loved cigars, so people started sending him thousands, literally thousands of cigar boxes as gifts. And being the ever-considerate man he
And
was, Grant started puffing away
not
so at least they
surprisingly,
didn't go to waste.
He smoked
Sometimes he
them
would even
all
chain
away
smoke,
until
like
he
20
died.
cigars
Rest
in
in peace,
one
Mr.
day.
Grant, and all
He slowly
his
turned into an addict
legends.
from something that was supposed to be a gift of gratitude that ultimately turned into the weapon that killed him.
Or
His story
gift of
actually
death,
gets
as I
stranger
would
because
call
after
it.
leaving office, Grant realized he was in a deep financial mess due to a crooked business partner. However, instead of retreating quietly and dying slowly in his last days,
Very
the man decided to
sadly,
write a
the
memoir so
Americans
his family
don't
wouldn't be left in debt and
road.
poverty after his death. He spent hours writing obsessively. Doctors, friends, and family members begged him to rest, but the man refused. He wrote feverishly, often while sitting on his porch wrapped in blankets, coughing up blood between paragraphs. Grant was determined to finish. And even though he was unable to eat, barely able to speak, and constantly in pain, he actually finished the memoirs and finally died just 3 days after completing
Wow,
the final
well
pages.
done to Mr.
The
Grant.
memoir was published after his
Am I
death
right,
and
chaps?
became a massive success and truly saved his family from financial ruin.
That's all of the most bizarre US president deaths. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please like and subscribe to both my channels. Face on my album called Sense of Fishery, not forcing. Oh, and also on the show, I'm trying to get to 25 subs on 1,000 views before summer, and on the main channel, not 6,000, not 7,000, not 8,000, not 9,000, but 10,000 views and 250 subs before summer. Not forcing for any festival. Also, I'm going to be doing some local store called Horton me soon, so look out for first posts. Bye, everyone. See you tomorrow for my next uploads on this channel, my other channel. Bye. Bye, chaps. Bye. Remember, if you leave North Korea leaves you in a sign. Anyways, bye. Bye. Glory to the Netherlands once again. As always, wonderful pictures and thanks again. You're welcome. As always. Anyways, bye. See you tomorrow.